Welcome back, everyone. We're now going back to hear further evidence from Mr. Stephen Howard. Mr. Howard, are you there?
I am.
Good. Hello. And you're ready to carry on, I hope.
Yes, I am.
Thank you very much. Well, then, Mr. Millett, when you're ready.
Yes. Mr. Howard, did you ever get to the bottom of Mr. Scott's conclusion that there was something inconclusive about the test report in its current draft form?
I don't believe I did. No.
Why is that?
The screen's no longer full screen. Do you mind? Can you give me a
top right-hand corner? It should say "View" or something like that.
That's it.
Yeah. Are you full screen now?
Yes, I'm full screen now.
Well
Sorry.
done. No, it's quite all right.
My question was, why is that?
I think at the time Robbie was taking, there was quite a bit of absence from BRE, and I just don't think it was ever resolved.
Right. You know that the report was sent out?
Yes.
And we'll come to it. It was on the 2nd of July. Are you saying that it was sent out without its inconclusive nature ever being resolved?
Yes, if that was yes, the test report went out. I didn't get a response back to why it was inconclusive.
Can we look, please, at BRE 403595? This is the BRE internal audit report in relation to this complaint. It's on a form dated the 6th of February 2013, as Mr. Clark told us, but the date of this document is the 6th of June 2014. And you can see that from the top right-hand corner. BGM Steve Howard, auditee Phil Clark. What does BGM stand for?
Business Group Manager.
And the activity is a technical complaint investigation. And you can see the background. Can you go to page 3, please? And at the very end of the document, it says, it is advised not to send the test report to Kingspan until this complaint has been concluded. Just pausing there and going to another document, BRE 403597. Can we just go to that, please? BRE 403597. This is an email also of the 12th of June 2014, which we saw before. If we go to the second email we looked at before, you can see that this is where he says that it's inconclusive. And in the last sentence, he says, I would advise not to send out the test report until we have resolved the complaint. So there we have it in two places, the report of the 6th of June and this email of the 11th of June. Do you know why the report was sent out before the complaint had been resolved?
I can't remember exactly whether there was a discussion over it or whether it was agreed to release the report. I don't think there was any response back to the email that regarding why the complaint is felt to be inconclusive.
Why would the BRE have sent the report to Kingspan at a time when the complaint was still being investigated and when the person charged with the investigation, Robbie Scott, had advised that the test report not be sent to Kingspan until the complaint had been resolved?
As I said, I can't recall the exact details around that, but the report that was issued was, we weren't clear on what was inconclusive. We had a position over whether, in our view, the sample wouldn't have met or the system wouldn't have met BR 135, and I felt it appropriate to send the report in that vein.
Was there, to your recollection, a degree of pacifying Kingspan as a good client by sending them this report even though the complaint hadn't been resolved?
No, I think the test report reflected the situation and the contract as it stood. We issued a report. The report basically stated that the test was terminated early. I think the only bit that could be inconclusive is if the report was then changed to say it was a pass, which it wasn't. It was basically sent out stating the test had been terminated.
Can we go back, please, to BRE 403595? We looked at page 3 in this document. Can we go to page 2? Here we see a heading testing, and it says, the test data was reviewed with Phil Clark and the following was noted. 1, the cladding wall logger and thermocouples in 38845 and 6 was last calibrated on the 18th of September 2012 and was due calibration on 24th of September 2013. This is now classed as a major non-conformance. And then you can see item 5, there are several other notations, but item 5, internal test procedures and result sheets are not controlled. First, what does not controlled mean there? What did you understand that to mean when you saw this document?
Essentially, any documentation that should ultimately end up in the BRE quality system and be signed off and approved.
Did it concern you at the time that the quality that there was documentation which had not ended up in the BRE quality system and been signed off and approved?
No.
You weren't concerned about that?
Not that they were not controlled, no.
Did it not concern you that there were internal test procedures and result sheets not controlled?
Well, they were I think, as we described earlier, some of this documentation was in development and we were working through it. It wasn't uncommon to develop new systems of working with documentation and software and integration with that and run those through the test process.
What was the point of Mr. Scott noting the fact here if it wasn't uncommon?
Because it's against, well, BRE's policy, I would imagine, would be to have controlled documents. But as I said, it wasn't unusual to run off draft documents if you were developing tests and you hadn't got around to that point of agreeing all the parameters that should be within those documents.
Did you take the matter up with Mr. Scott, Robbie Scott, and ask him what procedures and what result sheets were not controlled?
No, I didn't. As I said, Robbie was off for considerable periods around that time, I believe.
Well, he wasn't off, was he, in early June 2014 when he produced his report? Why didn't you ask Mr. Scott, once you saw this document, what he was talking about at item 5 there?
Because I probably didn't need to. Probably knew which was what documentation we were using in the files to record test results.
Looking at item 1 then, the cladding wall logger and thermocouples in 3 places, last calibrated in September 12 and due calibration September 13. This is now June 14, so 9 months later. Were you not concerned to learn that there had been a 9-month delay between the last due date for calibration and the date of this report, on a 6-month delay between the due date of the calibration and the date of the test?
Yes, that is of concern.
Were you concerned at the time to learn that?
Yeah.
What did you do about it?
The procedure would have been that we would have rechecked the calibration on the logger to make sure that that hadn't changed results in the meantime, to make sure the calibration hadn't shifted.
That may have been the procedure at the time. What did you do about it? Did you do anything when you learnt this fact?
Yes, I think I arranged for the loggers in conjunction with Phil to be recalibrated.
These were quite, well, that was quite a serious failing, wasn't it?
Yes.
Can you account for how it had come about that the BRE had left its wall logger and thermocouples, those three places, uncalibrated for 6 months after the due date for recalibration?
No, I can't. Shouldn't operate in that way.
When you say didn't operate in that way?
Shouldn't operate in that way.
I'm afraid I didn't hear you, and I don't think the transcriber did either. Could you repeat the answer one more time, please?
You shouldn't operate in that way. You shouldn't operate with uncalibrated equipment.
Thank you. Did you tell Kingspan that at the time of the 19th of March 2014 test, the wall logger and thermocouples were 6 months past their due calibration date?
I don't believe I did. No, I can't recall.
Why is that? Why is that?
Well, I don't know why that was. It may have been that by that time we knew the calibrator, we knew the calibration of the logger had been reinstated, or we verified the performance of the logger at that point. So there's a gap between the test and the recalibration of the logger meant that we knew that the temperatures were in, that it was within calibration.
Well, maybe, but do you know that?
No, I don't know that for a fact.
And would that mean that, in fact, at the time that you issued the test report, as happened in July 2014, the BRE would not have been in a position, and in fact nobody would have been in a position to issue a reliable BRE or BR135 classification report, would they?
It depends on when, or the results of the review and the recalibration of that logger, depending on when that took place.
Have you? Oh, sorry, did you want to finish your answer?
Now, this is something that we could look at to see when the recalibration of the logger was redone. It may have been in that intervening period. I wouldn't have those dates to hand.
Okay, let's see how this would have worked chronologically. Before the 6th of June 2014, you know that the cladding wall logger and the thermocouples were 6 months, or 7 months, in fact, I think, past their due recalibration date at the time of the March test.
I can't recall. I may have known, but if we could look at the evidence of what went on the calibration of that logger, then there'll be a definitive answer to that.
But I'm asking for your recollection. So, do you remember or not?
I don't recall, no.
You know, to the best of your recollection, whether after the 6th of June 2014, but before the 2nd of July 2014, when the test report was sent to Kingspan, the cladding wall logger and the thermocouples were recalibrated and checked. You know that.
I can't recall the exact date when it was done.
This would have fallen under your responsibility, as the business group manager responsible for cladding, yes? But you can't tell us whether or not there was in fact a recalibration so as to check whether the cladding wall logger and thermocouple data, which was produced by the March 2014 test, was re-verified.
No, I can't tell you without reviewing the material at the time.
Did you tell Kingspan that the test data produced by the March 2014 test would have to be reviewed against recalibrations of the cladding wall logger and the thermocouples?
No.
Why not?
because, as I said, that may have been done. The recalibration of the logger may have been done before reports were issued.
You would know that as the person in charge. No?
Sorry?
You would know that, wouldn't you, as the person in charge?
We have hundreds of instruments, thousands. We literally have hundreds and hundreds of items of calibrated equipment. It's a major issue, calibrating all the equipment in the lab. We even have our own in-house calibration services. I wouldn't know about the specific equipment in a specific lab.
Sorry, I don't understand that answer so far as I can hear it. The cladding wall logger and the thermocouples are at the BRE's premises, aren't they?
They are.
And recalibrating them would have been a relatively simple job, wouldn't it?
No, it's probably days of work to recalibrate a logger.
Days of work?
Yeah.
Right. So, and you would remember whether there had been days of work to recalibrate the logger? Wouldn't
no, because I wasn't in the labs on a day-to-day basis. Whilst it was my responsibility, ultimately, the responsibility for calibration of equipment would be down to local area managers. So the fire resistance laboratory would have hundreds of items that required calibration. Reaction to fire cables, there are literally hundreds of instruments within just my department that I was responsible for at the time requiring calibration. It was a constant ongoing process.
That I understand. But focusing on what you're told here, in the middle of a challenge to a test result, you would have remembered, surely, wouldn't you, whether or not you did actually order the recalibration of the cladding wall logger and the thermocouples that have been used for this test?
I wouldn't have ordered it. It didn't fall directly within my responsibility. It fell within the departments. But as I said, I was responsible for the items that I used on testing for their calibration. But the laboratories, each of the individual laboratories, now there was maybe 5 or 6, were responsible for the calibration of the systems in their own departments. I wouldn't know whether a specific item of equipment, unless I went down there and checked, was in calibration.
Coming back to my question, Mr. Howard, why didn't you simply tell Kingspan that the test data for the March 2014 test was not reliable because the cladding wall logger and the thermocouples needed calibration at that date and hadn't been recalibrated?
I don't know the answer to that. It may have been by the time the report that was issued, the system had been recalibrated. But I haven't got that information to hand.
Do you remember telling any other test sponsors that between the 24th of September 2013 and June 2014, their tests may not be reliable because the cladding wall logger and the thermocouples in 3 places had not been recalibrated on the 24th of September 2013 as required?
No, I don't recall that. I didn't make those notifications.
Why not?
Because, as I said, it will come down to when we were aware and when the systems were recalibrated. If those 2 dates were very close to each other, then we should make contact, or we should have made contact, but technically, if it's not going to change the result, it's probably wouldn't do it.
Let's go to BRE 405596, please, which is the document I think we looked at before. We may need this in the native version. There it is, thank you, we have that there. Now, can we please go to row 32, which I think is on the next page, page 2. And row 32 seems to be a chronology of what happened with this investigation into the complaint between the 8th of May 2014 and the 26th of January 2016. And first, can you just help me? Who would have been responsible for inputting the data that we see under column B?
I don't know. That I would imagine that that would sit with the QA department.
Was that Robbie Scott on this occasion?
I couldn't tell you specifically.
Let's go down then, if you look, please, at the date, the 12th of June, about a third of the way through the text. It says 12th June, and just to remind you, that's the same day when you ask Robbie June what is inconclusive in response to his 11th of June email. Do you remember? We saw that before. Yep. And as against 12th June 2014, it says, Robbie Scott met with Stephen Howard, report to be revised before being issued. Do you remember meeting Robbie Howard on that day or around that time?
I don't recall specifically, no.
You've got no reason to think, though, that you didn't, do you? No. And again, it says, report to be revised before being issued. Do you remember telling Robbie Scott, or perhaps him telling you, that the report needed to be revised before it was issued?
I don't recall that specifically.
But again, you can't deny that it happened, given that this is a contemporaneous record. Is that right? Or do you deny it?
No, I don't recall that specific meeting.
Can you tell us what parts of the report needed to be revised before being issued?
I think the only thing I can think of was the addition of comments into the observations. But as I said, I've no specific evidence of that or recollection. So I can't remember whether that was from Robbie Scott or whether that come from someone else.
In the next line down, we see that on the 2nd of July 2014, you send the report through to Ivor Meredith. You see that? 2nd of July, Stephen Howard to Ivor Meredith, the report of the recent test. Now, again, you've got no reason to think that it wasn't sent on that day, do you?
No.
No. Now, at this point, it's right, isn't it, that the complaint was still unresolved?
Well, as I said, in terms of QA, possibly, but Robbie Scott was absent over those periods of time, I believe.
Well, just looking at the document on the screen in front of you, Mr. Howard, you can see, can't you, that the complaint was still open until January 2016. Some 18 months later. But the bulk of the entries relate to the period after July 2014. You see August 2014 and into October and November of that year. You see that, don't you?
Yeah.
So the complaint was still unresolved when you sent the test report to Meredith. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know why the decision was taken to issue the report to Kingspan before the complaint was resolved?
Because we'd had a contract in place, we had been requested for a test report, we were basically completing that project. And the test report was reporting a system that didn't meet the requirements of BR 135. And as I said, the only way forward from there would be a report that did. So a test report that was issued that, in my view, reflected the situation as it was.
When you sent the test report to Mr. Meredith on the 2nd of July, as this record shows, why didn't you tell Mr. Meredith that the results were unreliable because the cladding wall logger and the thermocouples had not been recalibrated at the time of the test as they should have been?
It would be dependent on when the loggers were recalibrated. If they were recalibrated after that date, then yes, I should have said something to them regarding the calibration of the loggers. If the loggers were recalibrated before that date, all that calibration that confirmed was that the loggers were functioning correctly.
I think you told us earlier, just help me with this, that you never saw any document between the 6th of June and the 2nd of July 2014 to tell you that the test report could go out because the test data was reliable, notwithstanding the need for recalibration?
I can't recall seeing that, no. But it may not have been recorded in that way, and if we could have a look at those items of evidence, then we may be able to resolve this.
We can look at the report itself, but you can confirm for us that it nowhere says, does it, at least expressly, that the system could not be classified to BR135?
No, the test report will not include any, BS8414 doesn't include any pass-fail criteria. So therefore, it is a statement on the test standard.
Given that you knew that the test report might be used by Kingspan to obtain a BR135 classification from another test house, perhaps, why not simply add a bit of black lettering or red lettering in bold at the bottom or at the top, so that anybody seeing it would realize that this test report, in the opinion of the producer of that report, namely the BRE, was of the view that it could not be classified to BR135?
Well, there is a statement in the observations that basically says the test was terminated at the point in question. Now, a BS8414 report, you do not include reference to the classification document in the BR1. You do not record in the test report details of the classification report, and that is the procedure across all reactions via testing. The statement, the report, is a statement of fact as to what was tested to BS8414 Part 1 or 2. The classification can be BR135 or it can be another document. You wouldn't specifically put in a test report that it didn't meet a certain document. I felt that the test report as issued was clear on the basis that it had not been tested for the full duration.
In fact, it's right, isn't it, that the test report simply records that the test ends at 43 minutes. It doesn't, I think, actually say terminated.
I think it refers you to the clause in BS8414 that the test needs to go for the full duration.
So somebody reading it would have to work out what had happened. They have to work out that it had been terminated.
Read that and the associated standard, yes.
Now, just going back to the document that I think we've still got up in front of us, which is BRE 405596, the complaint log, you can see that Kingspan's complaint was simply closed in January 2016, in essence, because they gave up the point. Now, is that a fair way of summarizing it?
I think we'd had, well, I recall that they were contacted a number of times across that period by Marion. And I think that there's email evidence of us contacting to ask them whether they considered the report complaint to be still open.
Yes, I mean, we can look at this document, I think, for that, because it's a summary of the documents at the time. For example, look at the 26th of August 2014. Robbie Scott emailed Tony Miller chap, please respond if issues still unresolved. And then 28th of August 2014, Ivor Meredith Kingspan emailed Stephen Howard and Robbie Scott, are you any closer to resolving the complaint? Not directly related, but I have a telephone meeting with Sarah at BSI, etc. And then 21st of October, emailed Stephen Howard for an update since report sent to Kingspan in July. And then underneath, Mike Pratt sent to investigate on the 4th of November. Did you give Mr. Meredith an update or Mr. Scott an update? You remember?
I can't recall. but the management or the procedural process, as I recall, the issue was going to be raised at that BSI meeting.
And look on, 4th of November 2014, Stephen Howard replied, the complaint centred around standard interpretation, and our position has been that this is the way the standard is interpreted and this is how it is applied. Robbie Scott was going to go back to Kingspan and say politely, if we've not received any further correspondence or submissions from them, we will consider the complaint closed. And just pausing there, is that how it ended up?
Yes, I believe that's a fair summary of the complaint. No further correspondence or request to progress was received by the date of that.
So basically, is this right? BRE stuck to its guns in relation to its interpretation. Kingspan never pushed the point further, and in the end, the complaint was closed.
No, the complaint was raised at the BSI committee, which is referred to on the 28th of August. Now, I haven't got the exact dates of that committee meeting, but they could be obtained, and the issue and interpretation of the standard would have been discussed at that meeting. And as I understand it, because Sarah attended, and I believe Ivor Meredith was invited, I do not know who else attended, but it was discussed at that point.
Sorry, we spoke across each other. Did you attend?
No.
Did Sarah Colwell, I imagine Sarah Colwell.
Yes.
Did she debrief to you after that meeting?
Yes.
What did she say?
I think she relayed that it had been raised at the BSI committee meeting and the position that we took was confirmed by the BSI committee.
Right. And does that explain why we see no further? Sorry, let me put it again. Does that explain why, when you reply on the 4th of November, you stick to your guns, so to speak?
Well, we're not sticking. Well, we have interpreted that we can't issue a BR135 because the test hasn't gone to full duration, and that has been confirmed by the BSI committee responsible, on which, and King's Ivor Meredith would have got the papers for that as well.
Are you aware that this test report has also now been withdrawn by Kingspan and was withdrawn in October 2020?
Yes.
Now, can we go to BRE 4066? 4066. This is a desktop assessment report done by the BRE in relation to fire performance of the external wall systems at 190 Strand, Westminster, London, prepared for Total Facade Solutions. And the date is the 29th of June 2015. And if we look at page 2, we can see that the report was prepared by Andrew Russell and authorised by you. And the date is the 29th of June 2015. And if we look at page 5, please, section 2.
But have we, on that assessment report, I've not signed that.
Right. Are you saying you didn't sign off on this document?
Well, there could be, it could have been me, it could have been others, but the version of the report that you've got there is not the one that I have authorised.
Fair enough. Do you recall, perhaps you don't, it's just not a fair question, but do you recall signing off on the desktop assessment for this project, 190 Strand?
I don't recall whether I signed it off. I do recall this project.
You do. Well, we'll see if we can find you a signed copy, but bear with me in the meantime. Could we go to page 5? This is scope, and it says this assessment report considers the fire performance of the external wall systems for 190 Strand, Westminster, London, against the criteria of BR135, third edition, if tested in accordance with BSA 414, Part 2, 2005. So this is basically a desktop study done by the BRE for Total Facade Solutions for that project, yes?
Yes.
Yes. If we go to page 6, we can see the basis of the test, of the desktop study, supporting data. And then if you go down, you'll see by paragraph 3.1, BRE test report number 293940, issue 1, a fire test in accordance with BS 8414 part 2, 2005, was carried out on an external wall system on 19th March 2014. The system was described as a Kingspan K15 insulated system with a ventilated Trespa rain screen. And you can see there the components set out below it. And if we go to page 11 then, please. We can see the assessment. And you can see that the level 2 thermocouples are assessed in terms of their performance, aren't they?
Yes.
1, you see table 1, temperatures measured at level 2 in tested systems. Yes?
Yes.
And in the table in the first column, you can see BRE report number 293940, BS 8414 part 2 test with Trespa rain screen cladding. And just to be clear, that's the one from the 19th of March, isn't it? 19th of March 2014.
Yes, sorry.
That's because the number I asked you to remember, 293940. Yes?
Yes.
And this is the report that we were talking about until 2 minutes ago. Now, this report, this desktop report, doesn't anywhere refer to the fact that the test could not be classified to BR135, does it?
No, I doubt the record. No.
Well, I'm grateful to one of my team who's managed to find a signed version of this. Perhaps I should show you the one with your signature on it. It's BRE 4067. Can we just have that? BRE 4067. And go to page 2 there. There's your signature.
Thank you.
Now, maybe a while since you've seen this document, but take it from me that this report doesn't anywhere refer to the fact that that test, the March 2014 test, couldn't be classified to BR135. My question is, why doesn't it?
Because it's an assessment using data to draw a conclusion on another system. There's no requirement or I'm not aware of any requirement to meet BR135 for the documents then to be used for the purposes of supporting data to perform a review.
Have you ever come across a desktop report based on a test that couldn't be classified to BR135 for the purposes of a cladding system?
Have I? Not that I'm aware, but there's no requirement to test for a product to receive one BR135 classification to be used in an assessment.
Let's go back to page 11. We can do it on the signed version. And here we've got table 1, temperatures measured at level 2 in tested systems. And there are the temperatures in accordance with thermocouples at level 2 in each of the systems. But there's nothing there, is there, to tell you that the report in the leftmost column, report number 293940, had to be terminated early, is there?
No.
Nor is there anything in there to tell you that as a result, it could not be classified to BR135.
No, but as I said, this is basically a technical review of another system. And what you're doing is taking evidence from other reports in support of the technical arguments that you make to classify systems. There's no absolute requirement for cladding systems to meet the requirements of BR 135, to meet the recommendations of BR 135. There's no requirement within, or no recommendations within ADB for the systems having to meet BR 135. It's acceptable to use data from other sources in support of your review.
Do you accept that anybody reading this report and this assessment in particular within it would be led to believe that the system could in fact be classified to BR 135, when in fact it couldn't?
No.
You don't?
No, because it's the system that is being classified will be summarised elsewhere in the document, and the assessment will be specific to that system. The supporting data that you use to do that does not necessarily have to meet the requirements of BR 135.
So are you saying that a BRE desktop could just take bits of test data from a test and then use that to extrapolate to a desktop study for another project?
You potentially would use multiple reports covering various tested combinations. You may also use reports from cavity barrier testing and things like that. But all of the documentation and all the reports that are referred back to are listed in the report, in the assessment.
But what is there in this report to tell you that the test done on the 19th of March on K15 with the Trespa rain screen cladding had to be terminated early and therefore couldn't be classified to BR 135?
Well, I don't imagine there's anything in that report, but to say that doesn't stop you using a test report with test data in the support of it to build a technical case to assess a system.
The technical case would be based on only part of the picture, wouldn't it? Because although it may be based on accurate readings from the thermocouples during the test, it would be omitting a critical fact, which is that the test had to be terminated before the requisite period was up.
But the person undertaking the assessment would have had visibility of the test report. You wouldn't do it without.
The person undertaking the assessment is the BRE, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, and therefore my question is, why is the BRE, as the person undertaking the assessment, not giving the full picture here? Namely, that although the temperatures measured at level 2 in the tested systems reached these temperatures for this test, the test had to be terminated early and therefore couldn't be classified.
Well, as I said, you can use data in support of your argument. If the data is from a test report that we felt at the time was clear as to the restrictions on it, then I can't see an issue with using data in support of a technical argument to undertake a desktop assessment on another system.
What argument?
It's fire test data.
What argument?
Sorry.
You refer to an argument. What argument are you talking about?
A technical review.
Done by the BRE?
On the technical assessment of the system to be classified.
I'm not sure I'm understanding your evidence, Mr. Howard. Do you accept that anybody, an architect or a cladding subcontractor, reading this desktop report would look at it and think that the 19th of March 2014 test done with the Trespa was a sound basis for the extrapolation exercise done by the BRE? Do you accept that?
Yes.
And do you accept that it wasn't a sound basis because although the thermocouples showed those temperatures, in fact the test had to be terminated early and couldn't be classified to BR 135?
No.
You don't accept that?
No.
So you You're saying, are you, that it was a perfectly sound basis to perform a desktop study on a failed test?
Yes, because it's used in conjunction with other test evidence to construct your technical justification for the acceptance of the system.
So can I just come in here, Mr. Millett? If I've understood you correctly, Mr. Howard, what you're saying is you're just using these earlier reports for the data they contain, which is related to certain times during the test, as one can see from them. And I think you're saying it's irrelevant whether they went on to, or would have gone on to pass or fail. You're basically just taking the data, is that right?
You are using the data from the test report for assessment purposes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Supposing during the 19th of March test, having achieved these thermocouple temperatures, the rigger then exploded and burnt down the burn hole. Would you still use it as the basis of a desktop study?
It probably not, but it would be limited by the data that you'd achieve under that circumstance. Data is data. That what you select from that and what you use in support of your argument, that all we are using is the test data gained.
Mr. Howard, that would be fine if you identified the test data for the 2014 test as limited to that test data and gave the reader a clear warning that that test, in fact, was terminated and therefore couldn't be classified. And then the reader would understand the basis of the extrapolation. But I put the point to you again, aren't you misleading the reader when you don't give them the full information, but only part of it?
No, because the assessment is for a specific system. We are not approving, we are not saying the other systems contained within the document are BR135 compliant. We are not saying anything other than any other data that we've used in terms of cavity barriers are compliant. We have not classified those. You are using test data to produce a technical argument in support of the system that you are assessing.
It's not an argument, is it? It's an assessment.
A technical case, a technical submission.
It's not a case either. It's a statement, isn't it, of appropriateness of extrapolation. You're telling the reader that you can extrapolate from these three tests and therefore safely build the system proposed for 190 Strand. Isn't that what the purpose of this is?
No, the purpose is to give an opinion that it meets the requirements of BR135. And as I said, the data and the test reports that are contained within are there to justify that case. The systems don't need to be BR135 compliant, as I understand it.
Is there any reason why you couldn't simply spell out in the desktop so that the reader would understand the fact that the system had to be terminated early and that the test couldn't be classified to BR135?
Is there any particular reason? No, I don't. There's no reason, but as I said, the justification for using the test report is for the data it contains.
Are you aware that this test report, 293940, even though in fact the system did not meet the criteria in BR135, has been used in or as the basis for no fewer than 29 desktops in total?
I wasn't aware of the numbers, but as I said, it doesn't, if it's going into desktop assessments, it's a set of data that you can then use. If it's going into fire safety engineers to justify the inclusion or the construction of a cladding system, we are not saying that that system complies with BR135.
Well,
the system that we assessed, in our view, would.
Mr. Clark said in his evidence that he was shocked that the test report from the March 2014 test, which was unclassifiable, 135, had been used in this way. In other words, in so many desktops. Can you just explain, perhaps you can't, but can you explain why he would have been so shocked if it was a proper basis for an assessment, a desktop assessment?
Well, I don't believe that Phil Clark ever got involved in assessment. So, as I said, test data is test data. That is what you're using is the information contained within that report for your technical assessment.
Right. So just before we close off on this, so I really understand your evidence. You saying that the BRE, you authorising this report, could just select any piece of test data from the 19th of March test and just insert it into the assessment and then say, well, that's okay, that forms the basis of a proper extrapolation in this desktop study.
But you, in the situation that you're in, you would never use just a single report. But what you are doing is basically assembling a technical justification for the systems as assessed. That is pretty commonplace. And there's extended application rules, there's assessments go on to extrapolate data from test reports.
Mr. Howard, it may be my fault, but let me have one more go. Why was the fact that the 19th of March 2014 test terminated early, meaning it was unclassifiable, BR135, irrelevant when it came to producing this desktop study?
Because what you are using is that report to construct a technical argument to say a system meets the requirements of BR135 in our opinion. Now, say there could have been, without looking at the report and reading it in detail, you are just using a test report, one of 3 that are referenced in there. You could be using 5, you could be using 10 test reports. It is to construct a technical argument that the system that is going to be installed complies with BR135. Whether that in the end meets, whether the systems that you are using, if the data within the desktop assessment justifies that conclusion, then that conclusion is justified.
Mr. Excuse me again, I'm sorry to keep interrupting you. Mr. Howard, is your point, at least in part, this, that you're not extrapolating from a single BR135 or test result data? You are using data derived from a variety of different sources,
yes, in
order to reach a conclusion. And as we've seen from the report we had on the screen earlier, in this case, it was data as to the temperature, maximum temperature reached in a certain location within a certain time.
Yes, it's specific data.
And that goes into a melting pot, you, I think, are saying, with data derived from other sources in order to draw conclusions.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Willett.
Can you just help me with one thing? Could you go back to page 6, please? You can see that the first report on that page is the one we've just been discussing. Yes, 293940, which was a steel frame test done under part 2, yes?
Yes.
And this desktop assessment, is this for, what kind of cladding system was this for?
If you read through, there should be a summary of the assessed systems further down in the document.
There is. 190 strand, if you go to page 4, was going to be can you see that there? A stone-faced precast cladding, brick cladding, an aluminium rain screen facade, and a stone lattice framework with timber rain screen panels. Now, if you were asked to do a primary test on that system, would you do it under Part 1 or Part 2 of BS 8414?
It depends on how that's constructed. You haven't got enough information on that point to say.
Right. I think, in fact, it's a Part 2, isn't it? If you go to page 12. Go to page 12, and in fact over to 13. I think we can answer the question there. On page 13, conclusion, it says that the external wall systems for 190 Strand, as described in section 4, would satisfy the criteria of BR 135, third edition, if subjected to a test in accordance with BS 8414 Part 2. That is the answer to my question, and in fact, this was a Part 2 structure.
Yes, I mean, what we're saying is, or what the assessment report is saying is, it would meet BR 135 criteria if assessed to that standard, which is not the masonry substrate.
No, indeed. And so therefore, could you just help me with one thing? When you go back then to page 6, you can see there the supporting data. The first test is the one we've just been looking at, which indeed was a Part 2 test, 293940. Yes, that was indeed a Part 2 test. Yes?
Yes, sorry, this is a Part 2 test.
Yes, indeed. But if you go down the page, you see that the second piece of supporting data for it was the 2005. But was one on the 7th of July, Part 2 as well. But then you've also got at page 6, item 3.3, a BRE test report number 220876, which was done under Part 1. That's the 2005 test, isn't it?
Yes.
My question is, why are you using a Part 1 test as the basis of a desktop study designed for a Part 2 system?
Because what you are doing is looking at materials performance and looking at the performance of the system and using multiple data sets to understand the performance of the system in writing the assessment report. The data that is contained in those reports is valid to perform a technical assessment of the system that you wish to assess.
I now want to look at a different topic, which is how Kingspan's marketing literature and the results of the BS 8414 Part 1 test of 2005 were being viewed by the market. Can we look first, please, at an email exchange in 2013 between you and a gentleman called Wesley Bourne? This is BRE 403529. And you can see there that on the first page of that, there's an email of the 19th of March from him to you, Wesley Bourne, Far East Global, and the attachment is Cooltherm K15 rain screen board as a PDF. And he says, "Hi Stephen, please find attached for your perusal technical literature off the Kingspan website relating K15 Cooltherm. It appears to satisfy BS 8414 and BR 135 for buildings above 18 meters in height. Per our discussion this afternoon, we look forward to your favourable feedback after you confer with your colleagues in relation to our project-specific details. Should you require anything further, please don't hesitate to contact us." And attached to that email, I'll show it to you, is a copy of the 9th edition of Kingspan's marketing literature for K15 from March 2011. Can I show that to you? That's at BRE 403528. First of all, do you remember receiving Mr. Bourne's email and opening it and seeing this document?
No, I'm afraid not. I don't recall that.
It's a document issued in March 2011 by Kingspan, and it's called Cooltherm K15 Rain Screen Board Installation for Rain Screen Cladding Systems. Is it a document, do you think, you were familiar with from that time, or at least from 2013 onwards, 2014 onwards, rather, when you became in charge of cladding?
I think to say familiar with, no, I wouldn't say I was familiar with that document.
Right. I'll show you the text in a moment, but perhaps actually before we leave the document, can just look at it. Third bullet point down, it says, successfully tested to BS 8414 2002, can meet criteria within BR 135 and is therefore acceptable for use above 18 metres. Now, when you got Mr. Bourne's email, do you think you opened this document and read that?
I can't recall doing so.
Had you done, what would your reaction have been?
I'm not sure, really, looking at that.
Well, that's a guarded way of putting it. As they say, I would suggest that your reaction would be that that is a misstatement, because the fact that an insulation product had successfully tested to BS 8414 was acceptable for use above 18 metres.
But it does say can, doesn't it? It doesn't say does, it says can meet the requirements of BS 8414.
And is therefore acceptable for use above 18 metres. Would that not have struck you at the time if you'd looked at this as a misleading statement, because it suggests that it could be used on any building over 18 metres?
I wouldn't read that as being, I would read that as there's a qualification in there saying successfully tested to BS 8414 2002 can meet the criteria within BR 135. It doesn't say does meet the requirement as a standalone, it says can meet the requirement with BR 135.
So I was just trying to direct your eye to the last part of the sentence, which says, and is therefore acceptable for use above 18 metres. That part of the sentence, would that not have struck you as a misleadingly extravagant claim?
No, it doesn't. I think in the light of current circumstances, yes, it's not the sort of material you should put out. But in context of when this was going around and looking at it's a qualified statement, or I read that as a qualified statement. It's not saying it does meet the recommendations of BS 8414. It says it can meet under certain circumstances.
And let's go to BRE 403530. You respond, Mr. Bourne. And you say, Wesley, in our opinion, you need to test to BS 8414, but ultimately the decision and responsibility rests with building control, building owners, etc. I think these parties need to be consulted on this issue. The system you have described to me is different to that supplied on the PDF. BS 8414 is a system test and therefore provides evidence that the system underlined complies with BR 135. It cannot be assumed that if a system has reached an adequate performance to be classified to BR 135, that individual components will perform the same way in a different construction. Now, by this date, this is March 2014. In fact, it's the day after the Kingspan Trespa test by coincidence. Was it your experience that Mr. Bourne's interpretation of Kingspan's sales literature was typical of the market?
Not by that stage, no. I think it was just slightly later than that.
Right. When was that, do you think?
There was a meeting with the NHBC, which I think that was when there was obviously, or that, as I understood it, reports were being accepted without BR135s.
Right. When was that?
I think I've raised that in my evidence, so there will be a date on that meeting.
There are lots of meetings with the NHBC. Was this a meeting you?
Only one in my evidence, I believe.
And did it come as a surprise to you at that stage to learn that the market was interpreting, was interpreting Kingspan's marketing claims in the way in which Mr. Bourne has reflected here?
Well, as I've said, there's no BRE, approved document B is advisory, so there's no absolute requirement to test and get classified to BR135, which is why the reference is back to the building owner and building control. I think there was a perception within BRE that there was a lot of systems going on to walls without testing and without BR135, but ultimately it's not a regulatory requirement, it's advisory.
Well, when you say it's not a regulatory requirement, it's advisory. It's guidance within the regulation. It guides you as to how to comply with a mandatory obligation.
But it also says in the introduction.
Sorry, do you agree with me? It's guidance which guides you as to how to comply with a mandatory obligation. Yes.
It's guidance, but it makes it quite clear in the introduction to even the latest version of BRE, ADB, that it's acceptable for other sort of like routes to demonstrate compliance. It's not BS 8414 and BR135 is not the only route to compliance with ADB.
Sorry, let me just be clear about this. At the time, this is spring 2014, I'd assumed you understood this, but maybe help me. You couldn't use insulation above 18 metres unless either it was a material of limited combustibility or had passed the criteria in BR135 and had been tested under the methodology in BS 8414.
But that is from approved document B, which is guidance.
I see. So you're saying that it's only guidance and didn't have to be complied with?
Well, it says in the document itself that there's other routes to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations. It's not the only route. Sorry, this is quite...
Well, what other routes? If it's not a material of limited combustibility and hasn't passed a full system test, what are the other routes to compliance, apart from a holistic fire engineering study, which we understand?
Well, it could be holistic fire engineering, it could be desktop assessment, it could be the use of other data to justify the use of the product on the building.
What's that then? The use of other data to justify the use of the product on the building? What system or route to compliance is that?
Well, as I said, BS 848, you could potentially use a cladding test from another part of the world as your justification for submission to building control. As I said, the ADB is advisory. There could be fire engineering solutions, there could be desktop assessments. People could have accepted fire resistance tests on the outside of the system if properly conducted.
Just coming back to the point then on the email in front of us, we've got a customer in the market asking you in the BRE the question he's asked. I've shown you that, and you've given him an answer. My question to you was whether it was your experience that Mr. Bourne's interpretation of what Kingspan were telling the market about the usability of K15 was typical of the market. And your answer was not until a later meeting with the NHBC. That's your evidence so far, is it?
Yes, I think really the point at which, we understood it was obvious that there was a lot of systems going on to buildings without BR135s, but it was at a later meeting when the terms of that acceptance, it became apparent that people were not asking for BR135s.
Were you concerned at the time that Kingspan were marketing K15 as a product suitable for use over 18 metres, rather than making it clear that K15, when used in a specific system only, could be used over 18 metres?
No, I wasn't overly concerned. That concern was later. At that time, no, I don't believe I was.
Right. Well, let's look at the document again, BRE 403528. And see if there are any other aspects of the literature which caused you concern at the time. If you look at the third bullet point down, successfully tested to BS 8414 2002, were you not concerned that Kingspan didn't make it clear that the test was only to BS 8414 part 1?
No, I wouldn't. As I said, I don't recall reviewing this document in detail.
Were you not concerned that Kingspan were implying here that they had a BR135 report for a system incorporating K15 when in fact they didn't?
Well, at that time, no, I've not reviewed this document on that basis, and I wouldn't have had a knowledge of all the tests that Kingspan had undertaken. As I said, it was something that's sent through to you.
Did you not?
Been reviewed. I said, don't recall seeing this or reviewing it in that level of detail.
Did you not think to yourself, oh, I wonder where they've got a BR135 classification from? This is March 14, this is 18 months before you classified it, don't forget. At that time, did you not wonder where they got a BR135 classification from?
Yeah, but there's an assumption there that the BSA 414 test to 2002 was the only one that was conducted. And I was aware that there was quite a lot of other testing going on. I didn't have a list of tests in front of me that BRE, that Kingspan would have tested, or there's no reference to a specific test there.
Were you not concerned that Kingspan was saying that K15 as a product could meet the criteria in BR135, when in fact it's not a product test at all?
Well, no, because it says it can meet. It doesn't say it does meet, it says it can meet. And I took that as reading it now as a qualified statement.
Did you read the whole of this document?
Sorry?
Read the whole of this document?
No, doubt it.
Right. You wouldn't have been aware that it says that K15, when subjected to BS 8414, achieved the result shown. It shows later on in the document, page 6.
I wouldn't have reviewed this document in detail. It depends on what questions I was being asked by the client. And I think I've referred him back to the route that he needs to take for compliance.
Do you agree with me, looking at it now, that this is a thoroughly misleading document in a number of respects?
I think it should have been better qualified, and it should have been more accurate. It should give the standard number, and there should maybe a note in there to say, make it clearer the circumstances under which the product can be used and meet BR135. But as I said at the time, I don't really remember reviewing this in detail or seeing.
Let me just push the point. I'm suggesting to you that it's a thoroughly misleading document, among other reasons, because it presents K15 as a product test which has achieved a pass under BS 8414, which is not a product test at all. Do you accept that? No.
I think it says successfully tested to BS 84 and what can meet the criteria within BR135.
You accept that it's
a certain qualified system, that statement's true.
You accept that it's misleading when it says it is therefore acceptable for use above 18 metres without any qualification?
That statement needs to be qualified, and I accept that. And if reviewing this, that would have been my comment, really, that should have been a qualified statement.
And as unqualified, it's a thoroughly misleading statement. You accept that?
Well, I wouldn't call it thoroughly misleading. It's not as clear and concise as I believe it should be.
Did you discuss this marketing literature with Kingspan at all?
No.
Why's that?
Because, as I said, I doubt whether I gave this a thorough review. It was possibly a scan through. The question was back to the client. There was an email exchange with a client, which is quite difficult to remember. So I doubt whether I've read this in detail.
Did you discuss this piece of marketing literature with anyone internally within the BRE?
No, I don't believe so.
Mr. Chairman, it's now just gone 3:15. I'm going to turn to a different document, but it's about the last document in this run before we turn to a different topic. So
you want to take the document now? How long is it going to take?
5 minutes, probably. Depends on various things.
Well, if you're going to go to a new topic afterwards, let's do the document first, shall we?
Yes, thank you. Can we go to BRE 403397, please? This is an email from Tony Baker to you, and it's dated the 24th of July 2013. Hi, Andy. Strangely, me and Steve have just come out of a meeting with Wintech, and this project was mentioned, or one very similar. I would need more info on the through system build-up before commenting, but in general, the answer would be no, unless the system to be assessed was very similar to that tested. I believe the test data available from KS would be very limited, and the market is starting to get very confused through clever marketing by KS. I know Norman did an assessment some time ago. From what I can recall, it was an enclosed system, but from what we understand today, it wasn't built in accordance with the assessment, ! Cheers, Tony. Do you remember this email?
No.
Can you help? Do you know what the clever marketing was that Mr. Baker was talking about?
I don't really.
Did you ask? Did you ask him?
I don't recall.
Did you read the email?
Yes, I believe I would have read such an email.
You're not interested to know why the market was starting to get very confused through clever marketing by Kingspan?
Well, I think there was ongoing discussions at the time that it depends on what that marketing was saying. And I can't really remember the ongoing sort of like discussions with Tony or others over Kingspan marketing material.
It's clearly been raised as a concern by Tony Baker internally within the BRE. Did you take any steps to investigate what it was that the market was getting confused about as a result of Kingspan's clever marketing, Mr. Howard?
I don't recall doing so, no.
Why is that?
Because ultimately I'm not sure that we are provided as supplying into a professional market. I would question how confused architects and building control are over that material. As I said, it was only later that concerns over what was being accepted and what base that I started to have concerns over what was being accepted on what basis.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, certainly. Well, Mr. Howard, we'll have a break now. We'll come back at 25 to 4, please. And all right, no talking to anyone about your evidence over the break. All right, we'll see you a bit later. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue hearing from Mr. Howard. You there, Mr. Howard? Can you hear me? And can you? Yes?
Yes, you're not full screen. Yeah, that's it.
Right. Are you full screen again now?
Full screen again now.
One technical problem I was able to solve. Good. Okay, you ready to carry on?
I am, thank you.
Thank you. When you're ready then, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Can we go to your witness statement, please, at page 4? I'm turning to a new topic. And I want to ask you about paragraphs 17 and 18. These two paragraphs appear under the question 2A. What advice or guidance, if any, does or should the BRE give to test sponsors in respect of the design and installation of test rigs for BS8414 testing? In paragraph 17, you say that BRE does not and should not provide any advice on the design or installation of the cladding system other than as necessary for the safe construction of the test sample and compliance with the specimen requirements of the test standard. Indeed, those involved in testing are not permitted by BRE's accreditation provider, UCAS, to offer any such advice and or consultation services. And then you say in paragraph 18, in this respect, UCAS audits BRE for compliance with ISO 17025 for the testing laboratories and ISO 17065 for the certification services, respectively. These are internationally recognized standards for such activities. As BRE is a European notified body, there are rules associated with this as well. These standards require BRE to have rules in place to maintain its impartiality and integrity. These are backed up by BRE's procedures. The information which BRE obtains in relation to cladding tests is acquired from running tests for clients who pay for these tests. As such, if BRE's testing staff were then to become involved in direct consultancy, they could be divulging confidential information. This risk is managed by preventing testing staff from undertaking consultancy work. Now, you also say in your statement, I should say, paragraph 9, there's no need to scroll back to it, that the BRE is an independent and accredited testing laboratory. Is it part of your accreditation by UCAS that you're required to meet the standard ISO 17025?
Yes, that is what you are audited against.
And its full title, I think, is BSEN ISO 17025 2017.
That will be, yes, one of the later versions.
That's the later version. And there was a previous one, I think, in 2005, wasn't there?
I wouldn't know if...
Let's look at this a little bit more closely. BSI 401726, please. This is the 2005 version of ISO 17025. There's the first page of it, and it incorporates Corrigendum 1, which I think was from 2006. Am I right in thinking that this version would have been in place throughout the period 2005 to 2017?
Yes.
Can we look at page 12, please? Let's look at clause 4.1.4 under the heading Management Requirements 4.1 Organisation. 4.1.4 says, if the laboratory is part of an organisation performing activities other than testing and or calibration, the responsibilities of key personnel in the organisation that have an involvement or influence on the testing and or calibration activities of the laboratory shall be defined in order to identify potential conflicts of interest. And then if we go on to page 13, bottom of page 12, top of page 13, you can see under clause 4.1.5D, the laboratory shall, that's how it starts, and then D says, and it's the third one down, have policies and procedures to avoid involvement in any activities that would diminish confidence in its competence, impartiality, judgment, or operational integrity. See that?
Yes.
So when we talk about the BRE's impartiality in this context, is this what we are referring to?
Yes.
And at all times from 2006 and certainly from 2014 when you became more involved in adding the BRE, were you conscious that the BRE should have policies and procedures in place for this purpose?
Yes.
To the best of your knowledge, were policies and procedures in place which ensured that the BRE's testing activities were carried out impartially and with operational integrity?
Yes.
What were they?
Sorry.
What were they?
There was a standard of operating procedures that were available. There was lab-specific operating procedures. Within that period, there was code of conduct for staff as well.
Were those procedures monitored?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
All right. Did anybody have a particular responsibility for ensuring that those procedures were followed?
Well, you were subject to internal audits in the labs. Obviously, line management would have responsibility for the staff within their who they were supervising.
Yes. And so the line manager of, for example, Phil Clark would be responsible for ensuring, would he, that that whatever, for example, Phil Clark, and I just identify him as an example, would avoid involvement in activities that would diminish confidence in the BRE's competence, impartiality, judgment, or operational integrity.
Yes.
And you were Phil Clark's line manager, weren't you?
Not until 2000 and maybe 14, 15, something like that.
Just my question, perhaps you didn't pick up the end of it, was at least until 2014, from 2014. How did you go about monitoring or enforcing, supervising Phil Clark's compliance with the obligation to avoid involvement in the activities we've seen identified in the standard?
It's difficult to recall, really. There was a lot of emphasis placed on team meetings, and there was training available for staff. And I believe that BRE offered training in those sort of areas, but I can't remember any specific activities I undertook with Phil Clark with that.
Phil Clark told us in his evidence, and it's day 97, page 88, lines 23 to page 89, line 3 for the record, that he never received any training on impartiality, or in particular where the line was to be drawn between acting impartially and the giving of consultancy or advice. That was his evidence. Is he right about that?
Well, for the record, it would be possible to check. It would be possible to check his training records and see what courses he attended internally.
Well,
but my impression was he understood. Sorry, it's very difficult because we're talking over. So.
I'm asking you, is he right? Did he never receive any training? That's his evidence. He said he never received any training on where the line was to be drawn between acting impartially on the one hand and giving consultancy or advice on the other. I'm just asking you, is he right?
I'm not aware of specifically any training he was given, but I would expect he would have been given training at some point, and the BRE should be able to produce details of that.
Did you yourself ever receive any training of that nature?
I can't recall, really. But it may have been, I believe I have had discussions with people, advice from more senior members of staff throughout my career, because I've worked in both certification and testing, that you don't divulge confidential information.
Did you ever have any specific training on what constituted advice or consultancy on the one hand,
I can't recall.
Those two simply conversations, chit-chat, observations on the other?
I can't recall. As I said, BRE should have training records for specific individuals.
Yes. You can't recall. Is it that you can't recall one way or the other, or you as you sit here today, you don't remember ever receiving any such training yourself?
I don't remember ever receiving such training, but it was part of the culture there and part of your procedures that you didn't divulge confidential information and you endeavoured not to offer advice. Whether that was from a specific training course, I can't recall whether that was given, or whether it's historic over a number of years through exposure to colleagues, senior colleagues or whatever. I cannot actually state categorically that I attended a course at BRE on that subject.
If that's the case, you can't recall ever receiving any training of that nature, how did you go about your task of supervising Phil Clark and making sure that he stayed the right side of the line when dealing with clients?
I think the general instruction was not to engage in conversations talking about competitors' products, talking about offering advice as to an opinion as to what would pass. As I said, as a culture and a place that you worked, it was pretty much the norm, and it was one of those that it was the done thing, working in both certification and testing. Or even a lot of the testing that you deal with outside of UCAS is all highly confidential. It's not something you should discuss.
You say the general instruction. Was that general instruction written down so that each BRE employee involved in a test would know to the letter what to do and what not to do?
There was a code of conduct that was issued to the staff, which is probably worth reviewing. That's not in my evidence because I wasn't actually prepared to pass on this, but there was definitely codes of conduct with instructions of and information on what staff should and shouldn't do. Right.
Well, let's look at that and let's see how far we go. Could you go please to INQ 30144067? This is a document dated the 24th of March 2017, BRE Global Publication, revision 0.1. Can you see that?
Yeah.
And it's a statement of impartiality. And it says statement of impartiality at the top. Now, I'm going to show you some of the details in this document in just a moment. But when you referred to a statement of practice or code of conduct just a moment ago in your evidence, were you referring to this document?
No, there was another one that was signed by members of staff.
Oh, I see. You can see that the date of the publication of this document is the 24th of March 2017. Was there a precursor to this document, an earlier document?
I don't know specifically. I would be surprised if there wasn't.
Right, okay. Do you know what prompted the publication of this document?
It might have been the change of the standard, because the dates of the standard, you've got a new ISO 17025 issued at 2017.
I see. Let's just look at this. It says publication. What committee or group of people within the BRE would decide whether a document such as this should be published?
This would be at board level.
Right.
This is part of your quality system.
Did you sit on that board?
No.
When it was published, do you think you would have seen it at the time or very shortly after it was published?
there would have been notifications out for issuing of those sort of QA quality documents, yes.
Now, you mentioned the Code of Conduct a moment ago. Let me see if we can identify that from the record. Is this the document of BRE 405388? Let's have a look.
Yeah.
Okay, and when did that document come into force? I mean, when was it first used, to the best of your recollection, within the BRE?
I wouldn't know. It was quite, maybe in 2000, between 2000 and 2010.
Just scanning down that document, there's clearly an undertaking to comply with, among other things, the ethical requirements of BRE certification. But just help me with it. I don't think we see in there any clear undertaking not to give advice or act as a consultant in any way to a client. Am I right about that, or am I wrong about that?
Well, to treat as confidential all information received or obtained while performing duties for BRE certification, and not to divulge such information for personal advantage. Possibly it could be within that one.
Okay. Can we go back then to the partiality we were looking at a moment ago, the last document? Were you involved at all in the decision to publish this document?
No.
Were you involved at all in its drafting?
No.
Can we take it that, nonetheless, you agree with the principles set out in it?
Yes.
Now, the principles set out in it are quite broad. For example, if we look at paragraph 2, BRE Global also recognises the following potential threats to impartiality, and there's a list of them set out there. Did you ever receive any further guidance in relation to how to maintain impartiality, other than that set out in the Code of Conduct we've seen, or this statement of impartiality?
I can't remember specific training. As I said, it was part of your day-to-day work that you kept things confidential, avoided giving advice. It was just known as a no-go area, really. But I can't remember specific training.
Looking at paragraph 3, it says, BRE Global has therefore established a committee for safeguarding impartiality, whose primary function is, A, to assist in developing the policies relating to the impartiality of our certification activities, B, to counteract any tendency on the part of BRE Global to allow commercial or other considerations to prevent the consistent objective provision of our certification activities, C, to advise on matters affecting confidence in certification, including openness and public perception, and D, to review the impartiality of the audit, certification and decision-making processes of the certification business of BRE Global. I've read all that to you. In terms of, well, in relation to the committee that's referred to there, who was on that committee at this time, from this time, March 17?
I don't know. It would have been the sign-off for those. It would have been the responsibility of the compliance department to draft and produce those documents. So who was actually involved in that, I wouldn't know prior to publication.
Looking at item 3B, to counteract any tendency on the part of BRE Global to allow commercial or other considerations to prevent the consistent objective provision of our certification activity. Had there been a concern before March 2017 that the BRE had been allowing commercial or other considerations to prevent the consistent objective provision of certificates?
None that I was aware of. But can I ask that maybe the date of publication of this document and the reasons for doing so, maybe that's something that BRE can address, because I haven't got the background or knowledge of the reasoning for the reissue of that document.
What about D, lack of impartiality in the audit, certification and decision-making processes of the certification business of BRE Global? Had there been a concern about that?
No.
Has the committee ever had to consider you or your work during the time you had at the BRE, at least from 2014 onwards?
No.
Can we look at BRE 403670, please? This is an email exchange in July 2014 between the BRE and Kingspan regarding LPS 1581 and BS 8414 Part 2 assessments. If we go to the bottom of page 2, we can see there's an email from Ivor Meredith to you and Damien Ward of the 10th of July 2014. See that? If you go on from the bottom of page 2, it goes on over a few pages to page 4. And at the top of page 4, item 9, it says, finally, we wish to progress the next 2 tests at your earliest convenience. However, have requested some feedback off Stephen Howard as to the best way to test going forward. Stephen, can you please advise how soon we can look at this? Now, if we go back to page 2, you can see your response to Ivor Meredith on the 11th of July. Page 2, you say, see below, Stephen Howard. And that indicates, I think, am I right, that you've responded to his various queries by commenting in his email in text highlighted in yellow. Is that right?
Yes.
I see. So just following it down then, bottom of page 2, where it says, okay, the quote is quite straightforward. That's you, is it?
Yes.
So then if we go back to page 4, under item 9, it's you, isn't it, then, who says this: I think the time now is opportune. What I don't have is an idea of all the variables that need to be covered, or more importantly, what stays the same and what your main commercial drivers are. Would half day with the Kingspan insulation team at yours be the way forward? Now, do you recall Mr. Meredith asking you for feedback as to the best way to test going forward?
The conversation would be around basically testing so that you identify what are the worst case scenarios to test, i.e. what are the hardest systems to test. And the aim would be, and it's common across the fire industry, and it's common across the test labs, to set your testing up so you are testing the worst case scenario. So potentially, if the testing's successful, you can then, via assessment, say, we accept this data and we believe on this basis, on the basis of that test report, that this modification to the system is suitable.
Did you actually have a meeting, the half day with the Kingspan insulation team?
No, I don't believe that ever happened.
Why did you suggest it?
So that I could understand the number of different systems that they wish to place on the market, or what they perceive they could get from a set of tests, and to provide basically a framework where we could identify the systems and the samples that we considered would be the hardest to test, or the hardest to meet the BR135 criteria.
Why did you need to understand what they perceived they could get from a set of tests?
Because if they are doing multiple tests, that data could, at the time, could and still can be used for assessments or extended applications. And knowing those rules means that you can test for the test reports to be accepted into a set of rules that exists in the standard or within the organisation.
You say that you wanted to understand the number of systems they wanted to put on the market, and to provide a framework, you say, basically a framework where we could identify the systems and the samples that we considered would be the hardest to test. In summary, are you saying that you wanted to have this meeting with them so that you could glean more information from them with a view to being able to give them that advice?
Well, as I said, it's standard laboratory practice to advise the clients of the most onerous testing configurations. It's done often. Now, without knowing what they were aiming to achieve, we couldn't do that. As I said, that's standard laboratory practice. In some areas, there's documents and guidance and rules in place. In other areas, like cladding, that's only recently been developed. But without knowing what they look to achieve, we can't set the test programs up.
You can't set the test parameters, did you say?
The test programs of test.
Was it common for feedback of this type to be sought from you by clients?
It's common across the fire testing sector. It's common across the test labs.
Yes. Was it common for feedback of this type to be sought from you by clients?
Yes, either directly or indirectly.
Was it common for this type of feedback to be given by the BRE and for these types of meetings and discussions to be held with clients?
Yes.
It looks, on the basis of what you've told us just now in this email, that this is a request by them for commercial advice. Do you accept that?
No, it's not commercial advice. It's actually defining what you should test to maximise the scope of the testing. And as I said, it's common. There's things called extended application rules that are associated with test standards. There's direct application rules that are associated with standards, and laboratories are expected to know and implement those rules.
Why did you ask Mr. Meredith what his main commercial drivers are?
To understand the systems that they were looking to cover, not actually what's your main commercial drivers, in that what are you being asked to put up on walls?
Well, that's not quite the same. Why did you ask him what the main commercial drivers are, rather than what configurations you want to test?
Turn of phrase, it would be, what are you being asked to put up on walls, basically. Well, that's what that meant. What's your drivers?
Well, what are your main commercial drivers? We can argue about the language, but you're asking him what his financial goals are, or what his financial motives are. Why was that of any concern of yours?
Well, I don't believe it was asking him what his commercial... It was the turn of phrase, and which was used at the time was, what's your drivers, i.e. what are you being asked to produce the most of, or what markets are you being asked to address? What systems are you being asked for BR135 or testing to 8414 and BR135? As I said, it's a common question.
Who was the Kingspan insulation team that you were suggesting you should meet to be able to gather more information?
It would have been at that time either Meredith and whoever else you wished to bring in.
Well, you didn't suggest a half-day meeting with Ivor Meredith. You suggested one with the Kingspan insulation team. My question was really directed at who else you wanted to see in order to obtain the information so that you could provide the feedback that you requested.
Well, it would have been other people that could have supported either or provide the information on what they needed to test or what they were being asked to supply into the market and the technical configuration of those.
Let's go to BRE 405054, please. This is quite a long email chain in August 2014 between Kingspan and the BRE. So we'll take it in stages. Can we start with page 4? This is an email from Ivor Meredith to Phil Clark and you, and to Damien Ward as well, copied to others at the BRE. Ivor Meredith says, under the subject, Scam from Singer, thanks, Phil. Another question for you and Stephen and Damien. Once this is boxed off, we're good to go. We would like to test 200 millimeters of insulation. However, my current lead time for this product is very long. Thus, it would be more practical to test using 2 layers of 100 millimeters. This would be installed using exactly the same construction as previously tested. If we do this, are the BRE happy to write into a classification assessment that this result would cover exactly the same construction with an individual multiple layer insulation thickness varying from 80 millimeters to 200 millimeters? Now, just to be clear, this email chain is in relation to BS8414 tests on systems incorporating K15. At least, have you any reason to disagree with what I've just put to you?
No, it would have been based on that.
Yes. And if we go then up to page 3, please, we can see that you respond to Ivor Meredith on the 18th of August 2014, copy to Phil Clark, subject cladding tests. And you say, Ivor, as a minimum, we would need tests at either end of the insulation thickness range. Building up 200 millimeters in layers for a single test doesn't really give us that info, if I've understood correctly. Is the 200 millimeter system going to be a repeat of one of the existing tested systems? I'm also aware of the request below from you. And then in italics, you say, I appreciate your position, comments and other queries. With regards to the next 10 tests, we need to move on this quickly. Thus, we will try and sketch out the sort of scope we desire. And then you go on to say, I need to fully understand the variables we need to consider. The offer still stands for me to come up to you and go through this so we can try to meet your requirements. And you then quote a section from an earlier email, I think, regarding Mr. Meredith's request for feedback on the best way to test going forward and your offer for the half day. And you can see that that's now become item 1, but it was item 9 in the email we looked at earlier. Yes?
Yes.
And then at the end of that little section, you put, how do you want to progress the planning of the next series of tests? Now, just pausing there, what are the other queries that you're referring to in the italicized section?
There might have been other testing going on. I don't have a specific recollection on that point. There's probably other emails around that time that I don't recall that would actually directly answer that question.
Now, I think you told us that the half-day meeting that you suggested never went ahead. Did the discussion go ahead in another form, on telephone, email, matters of that nature?
I don't believe it did. I just don't think we ever got to that point of reviewing their systems and basically saying, if you want to change, if you wish to test, if you wish the scope of a document to be max and min insulation, that you have to test both. I don't believe we ever got there.
Now, we can then, if we go up to page 2, we can see Mr. Meredith's response to you, same day, 18th of August 2014, again, copy to Phil Clark. And he says, "Hi, Stephen, thanks for coming back to me." And then he goes on, "This would be tested in exactly the same configuration as the last test. However, we would be looking to do an extreme of thickness, i.e. so we can extend our approval to, quotes, perhaps, quote, state behind terracotta K15 within a system can meet the requirements of BR135 at thickness in single and multiple layers from 80 to 200 meters. As discussed, we are capped at 120 millimeters at the moment, but would like to cover up to 200 millimeters. Could we do this in 2 times 100 or 80 plus 120 millimeters? We seek your guidance. We seek your guidance at the earliest possible opportunity, as I would like to start shipping materials and bring the leftover material back." And then he goes on over the page. "With regards to the other questions that are secondary compared to this query, please call if easier." Do you recall whether you did in fact call Mr. Meredith to discuss the subject of this email?
I don't remember whether I called him.
It's very clear from what he's asking you, isn't it, is that he was wanting your guidance. Did you go back to him and say, "Well, I'm terribly sorry, I can't give you this kind of guidance"?
But all we're being asked there, which is standard laboratory practice, is to define the limits in which he would need to test if we can then feed into an assessment report following. That is standard laboratory practice across reaction to fire, fire resistance, and other areas.
We can see your response if we go to page 2 a little bit higher up the page. You say, and this is now the 20th of August 2014, "The approach seems sensible and we can accommodate the range of insulation." Sorry, I'll wait for it to come up on the screen. You see, it says, "The approach seems sensible and we can accommodate the range of insulation. Same build-up of system, but with thicker insulation. We will likely need to consider how the boards are mounted in terms of liner so that there is no discussion later if you want to mix and match foam thicknesses. On the strip down, it'll probably be worth looking at how far in the board was affected by the fire for future reference. When are you going to start to ship?" And then if we go to the bottom of page 1, we can see Mr. Meredith's response to you, also on the 20th of August. And he asks you the question, what are the possibilities to mix and match the foam thicknesses, i.e. can 2 times 100 be argued to perform the same as a 150 and a 50? Ideally, we would test with 200, but it's simply not available at this time. And then he goes on over the page, top of page 2. As far as mounting goes, they will just be thrown up in a brick bond pattern with plastic fixers. I'm looking to ship as soon as we have this question answered. Any advice is appreciated. Any advice is appreciated. And you respond the next day. We can go back to page 1 again, please. 9:36 on the 21st of August. Middle of the screen there. Morning, Ivor. We were on the same wavelength. I'd made the assumption that it would be 200 millimeters, either as a single slab or in sections. The comment regarding the mounting, which I should have been clearer on, was in reference to the facing section on the insulation. Current thinking is that this should be installed with no facing material between sections. This should provide a worst case scenario and answer any questions should these be raised in the future. Can you let me know timescales for shipping? Are we at the point now where we should look at options to allocate a frame for your future tests so you go back on the same frame, or do we need to see how this one performs? Now, when you say current thinking is that this should be installed with no facing material between sections, it's highlighted in yellow. What did you mean by that?
Insulation material can come in a variety of facing materials on the front for various purposes. The current thinking was, if they wished us to state that 80 and 120 mil of insulation would be have a similar performance or the same performance of 200 millimetre of insulation, that those facing materials shouldn't be present because the view at the time, that was the worst case scenario.
So just so that I've got your evidence, did you mean that when it was mounted for the test, the section slabs of K15 joining each other to make up the total thickness required should not be faced?
That's right.
Because that would then provide a worst case test rig.
Yes, that was the proposal at that time.
Yes. Was that not advice about the design of a test rig?
As I said, it's standard. We don't regard that as consultancy advice. It's just standard laboratory practice to review all the parameters that you're going to test, ask the questions to make the test the most effective. It's not saying to either, well, you shouldn't test like that because it will pass or fail. It's saying to either, or saying to others, if you test at 200 millimetres in this configuration, we can express the opinion that this is a worst case scenario. It's not providing advice that the system will pass or fail. It's telling them what is laboratory practice and what is fire testing practice for dealing with multiple thicknesses of insulation.
No, but isn't it advice about the best way to set up the test rig?
It's advice in terms of the most onerous test configuration, i.e. if you test without facings, then we will be in a position to say you can test with either a homogeneous insulation or in slab form. It's not advice saying, if you do this, you will pass.
No, I understand the qualification you're putting, but I think you accept that it was the giving of advice about the design of a test rig in order to achieve, or in order to establish a worst case kind of rig.
Yes, it's information provided to the test sponsor, which I said is common across the whole of the labs, what the standard approach would be and how we should deal with it.
Do I take it from that answer that this sort of advice was something that the BRE commonly gave its clients other than Kingspan?
It's common across the fire testing units, yes.
Well, I was talking about the BRE. I'll repeat the question.
It's common across BRE fire testing units.
Can we look at BRE 403449, please? And I'd like to go to page 2 in that. This is part of an email chain from September 2013. Page 2 is an email which starts on 12th of September 2013. In fact, I think it ends that day as well. It's the last email on the screen in front of you. And it's to Martin Kilbride and Jay Humphreys. This is an email of the 12th of September 2013 from you to Martin Kilbride and Jay Humphreys. And can you just tell us who they were? Do you know?
Jay Humphreys and Martin Kilbride basically worked out of Holywell, which is to the north of Wales. So they dealt specifically with the sandwich panels, which are the twin skin products with a PIR insulation between the outer skins.
Right. Just and which organisation do they work for? Just to be clear.
It's Kingspan Limited.
And you say Martin J. Has Kingspan any further thoughts on the scope of the cladding tests? See that?
Yes.
Were you referring there to tests involving K15?
No.
What were you referring to? Is this sandwich panels?
Yes.
Right. Going up then to page 1, we can see Martin Kilbride responds to you on the 11th of October 2014. And he says, I'm sorry, yes, 11th of October. Apologies for the delay in getting back to you. The attached info is a helicopter view of things. If you need extra details, we can drill into these when needed. And then he sets out a summary, 8 types of construction for consideration, and some further details below that. And he then asks a basic question just below those 6 bullet points. He says the basic question is, would the testing of items 4, 6, and 8 allow for the assessment of other systems? For example, take system 8, its vertical AWP, would the testing of it approve system 7, for example, i.e. horizontal AWP, or would we test the horizontal AWP to approve both orientations? One other point, on the thickness of the panel that we test, do we go with the thinnest or the thickest? At this point, the guys, I think it should say, are only looking for 150 millimeters on the Create system and the 100 millimeters on the CS and AWP systems. However, the CS-based system in the future could be 100 to 175 millimeters, and the AWP could be 100 to 150 millimeters. So could do with your opinion on this also. The end game being approval to BR 135. If we can iron out some of this, we can start making plans. Let us know what you think. This was I know it wasn't K15, as we can see, it's sandwich panels, but this was a clear request for advice from you from Kingspan, wasn't it?
It's a clear request for us to stipulate what we thought was the worst case scenario for testing, and to therefore allow data to be used for assessment purposes. It's not, if you test in this configuration, we think you'll pass. It's, we think you need to test at both ends of this variable. From experience, we believe this configuration would be worse to test than that one.
And your response comes at the top of page 1, 11th of October, about 30 minutes later on the same day. You just say, thanks very much, we will begin to review. You don't say, I'm terribly sorry, we can't give you an opinion about how to set up your test, do you?
No, because the scope of what we were doing was clear, and the limitations of that is to define what we consider to be the most onerous set of test configurations for then to be used for assessments. Now, that is the process that's going on, and all I can say is that's common across BRE and fire testing maps.
Can we go to BRE 403448, please? This, I think, is a further email run in the communications between you and Jay Humphreys and Martin Gilbride. And if we look at the second email down on that page, you'll see that it's an email of the 1st of November 2013 from you to those 2 gentlemen. Jay, Martin, we've been through all the systems, and this is our current thinking on a test and assessment program. Then you set out some details. And then you go, as you say in the penultimate line, we are happy to use this as a starting point for discussion. Again, this is clearly, isn't it, the BRE giving advice to Kingspan about their testing plans? Yes?
No, it's advice telling them what we consider to be the most onerous configurations. So if we do this, then we're not saying whether it passes or fails. What we are saying is that will give you a set of data that we can use for other extrapolations. And as I said, it's common throughout the fire industry, fire testing industry.
Yes. Was this question not one solely for the test sponsors? Maybe they come along with a rig and they ask you to test it, and you produce the results.
No, as I said, the current system is there's considerable numbers of extended application rules, direct application rules, product standards, classification documents that give a whole list of parameters that you should consider in test programs. There's a lot of documentation out there. I think it's appropriate for test laboratories to know those and to be able to say, if you wish this range of insulation thicknesses to be covered, you should test at max and min. If you want a range of colours to be tested, then the information or guidance that we can access is this. It's not telling them what they need to do to get through a test. It's telling them what we consider to be the worst case scenario.
Well, it's clear from this email and all the others we've seen up to this point, but at least on this one, that you're setting out the BRE's opinion on an appropriate test and assessment program. Given that, as we can see from this email, your own words, how do you consider you were able to give that advice while at the same time remaining impartial?
Because the advice is not on the advice is not advice on how to get through the test. The advice is giving experience or knowledge on what test parameters are critical and what should be tested to maximise the effectiveness of the test programme. As I said, there's lots of rules, there's lots of documentation that's available in support of this.
And why would that not be the giving of advice or consultancy?
Because what we're not doing is, all we're doing is imparting standard knowledge with regard to testing. And all we are saying is, you need to test in this configuration. We are not saying, if you test in this configuration, you will pass, because we don't know the result of that.
When you are answering my question about impartiality, are you telling us that in fact you thought that you crossed the line into partiality when you advised on what would pass or what would fail? Is that where you draw the distinction between partiality and impartiality?
Yes, I think at that point, if you get into the expression of an opinion, then you are I think that is problematic.
But you were giving an opinion, weren't you? Frequently an opinion on the best kind of rig to test.
No, I was giving an opinion on what the upper and lower parameters would be and what the worst kind of rig to test is. There's no information in there that says this will pass. It's the best data you will get will be, or the most usable data is if you follow this configuration and it passes.
Is it fair to say that throughout the emails we've been looking at, and I've given you a selection, it was the BRE's practice to work closely with, collaborate, use the chairman's word, with Kingspan on the design and configuration of their test rigs?
It wouldn't go as far as design. It would be setting the parameters between which your client should test. So as again, it would be max insulation, minimum insulation. You might have to consider colours and things of that nature.
And in the email we've just looked at, not the one on the screen, but we've just looked at, the end game was approval to BR 135. So you were being sought your views with that as the ultimate goal, weren't you?
Well, as I said, they would ask what technical reviews we could carry forward from a set of test data, and that was the information that we were providing. And as I said, it's knowledge of testing principles and extended application rules is used on a regular basis.
Well, do you agree that while you were in this role as joint business group manager at the BRE, you were closely involved in providing guidance and advice to Kingspan in relation to testing and assessment of a variety of external cladding facades, and gave advice as to which of a number of specific construction types you would recommend?
Well, the guidance is basically what is the most onerous to test and what we could cover with that test data. I think that the scope of information provided to the client, I think, is there in the emails. It's not advice, it's not telling them how to pass, it's not telling them, or actually you need to do this, actually we know that this product type performs better than this one. It is the parameters to consider when they're putting forward a test program.
Do you accept, in the light of the emails we've been looking at, that you did not maintain, by giving this advice, the standards of impartiality that we've seen in the standard, the ISO standard, and the rule that BRE was not supposed to advise clients?
No.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
I was just about to suggest it might be, Mr. Millett, so I think it must be. You got some more questions, I imagine, from Mr. Howard, have you?
We have. We've come to a natural point in the questioning anyway for a break, quite apart from the fact that it's...
But I think he might like to know how much longer you're going to detain him.
Yes, well, I think we have already said that it would be for the morning tomorrow, but if we can go a little shorter than that, then that will obviously be helpful to him.
Yes. Well,
likely that we'll take the morning.
Right. Well, Mr. Howard, you, I think, were warned that we might need you again tomorrow.
I was.
And it sounds as though we shan't need you beyond lunchtime, if that's of any help. I don't know. So we're going to stop there for the day. Please remember not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it over the break. We'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow, and I think there's a fair chance that you'll get away by lunchtime.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll see you tomorrow. All right, okay. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you.